Welcome to episode 2 of Vox Rationis with me, Trish Karthik.
And Aditya Kashyap.
This is the podcast, the place where we talk about world issues from a student's perspective. First off, we'd like to thank you all so much for tuning in to our previous episode. We received so much wonderful feedback from all our viewers. We hope to keep you all engaged in our following episode, and we try to make it as interesting as possible for you all.
Yeah, so going off of what Trish said, we were both heartwarmed by the countless positive feedback which we got from our friends, parents, and teachers. And well, admittedly, this is a very small project, but we are incredibly ambitious teenagers, and we plan on covering diverse political issues from across the world. And we believe that this would be a great platform for us to be able to do this because, like we mentioned in our previous episode, the main reason why we're doing this is to improve our thinking skills, debating skills, more importantly, our reasoning. So, that being said, among the feedback which we got was that we were told that we could be a bit more informal about the way we present ourselves, and we totally agree. Having listened to our podcast itself, we believe that it would be a far more enjoyable experience if we were to be slightly more free. And we very much hope that we'll be able to do it this time around. So, this episode, we are going to be talking about freedom of speech across the world. So, hope you guys enjoy.
As one of the feedbacks which came was, we need to be a bit more free, we need to be a bit more informal in our approach to the podcast. So, we thought, why not do an episode on freedom of speech? Aditya, what comes to your mind when you hear the word, let's say, freedom of speech or freedom of expression?
Yeah, so for me, freedom of speech is one of the more funny things about modern society because I personally get two caricatures when I think about it. The first one is, that person who cries out freedom of speech whenever they're challenged about their opinion, and if it's even, and it's a rather inflammatory opinion in this response, in this regard, and they generally feel like this response is enough to sort of feel secure that they can say whatever they want no matter what, and they don't get any consequences added to them. So this is the one person, and the other one, and it's often more saddening, is the situation where it's the common man or even a journalist who is being persecuted for saying something. It doesn't necessarily need to be inflammatory in this case. Oftentimes, for the journalists, they're reporting on a particular issue and they end up being heavily scrutinized on it, and probably in the near future, even persecuted and even imprisoned for that matter. And this is the one where it generally happens in oppressive regimes. But as we've been seeing, it could even be happening in a regime which is not as oppressive. So, for me, in my opinion, freedom of speech is something which generally is not as understood as other issues because it, to me, feels almost deliberately ambiguous, because freedom of speech, well, it can mean different things to different people, and it can mean different things to different governments for that matter. So when we look at freedom of speech, I refer to the UN's Article 19 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as my reference point. And in it, it says that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So the UN being the UN, it's probably going to be a more verbose definition. But since this is a rather contentious issue, I believe that it generally serves its case. And what I feel like this particular definition says is that people will be able to get their opinions and get their information from varying medias. And what would basically be happening is that they wouldn't really have the fear of any form of persecution or any form of jailment. And as we'll probably be seeing in the next couple of minutes, freedom of speech varies very much across the world, and it's really something which is not as black and white as other issues in the political spectrum for different people. So I believe that freedom of speech is important because, for me, I've always been the person who feels that we should be able to speak about a variety of topics. And the real reason why I feel that freedom of speech is important in this particular regard is that we should be able to have these dialogues where no matter how taboo an issue is, we'd be able to, at the end, come to some sort of consensus and come to some sort of agreement. I'm of the opinion that politics is getting more and more polarized across the globe, and for me, the only way which we can really resolve this is through dialogue. And if dialogue is suppressed in any way, it's not true dialogue, is it? Because people are going to be scared of what they can and cannot say. So that's it from me. Trish, what about you?
So, as you said, the when freedom of speech is talked about, one thing that comes to my mind is the contrast or the differences between how it's approached in different countries. So, for example, one country, perhaps maybe the US, may say that you may be a bit more free on what you can say and what you cannot say. But then you could take maybe another example, like maybe China, India, or maybe in Saudi Arabia, where they say that freedom of speech, maybe you may have to be a little more wary of what you say. You will face certain consequences. So freedom in that way, says that it's the power or right you have to do something or to act in a particular way, or think or even speak about speak about certain ideas, do whatever you feel you should do, or do whatever feel you want to do without facing any adverse consequences. And in that way, let's say if I have it can be it's very important because it comes under criticism. Because let's say I criticize a particular person, let's say be it in a sports person, I don't like the presence of a sports person in a team. I can criticize saying that I feel that he needs to improve his performance, or he should probably be replaced by another person in the team. And I feel that that is my freedom to say that. And that is important because if you bring it into, let's say, a political sense or a societal sense, uh, freedom of speech allows the creation of a marketplace of ideas. And only when such a marketplace is created can ideas be re-examined. So existing societal norms should, only if they are re-examined, can you say that, okay, now we need to change a particular way of thinking. Or we may even say that, why not, it's perfectly good as it is right now, let's stick with the certain societal norms. So only when we have the freedom of speech can we actually get to the process, or come to the mode of come to, let's say, progress society in a certain way, and hopefully better our lives in that aspect.
All right, so now that we've given a bit of an explainer about what freedom of speech actually is, I think it's worth talking about why is it actually important? Why should we even be talking about it? Because after all, we're just teenagers, aren't we? But the thing is, freedom of speech, it isn't, like I mentioned, a very black and white issue. And freedom of speech can affect people in varying industries and varying sectors of human society. And I think um, especially since so many things are happening across the globe. Coincidentally, today there was a coup in Russia, where the Wagner Group is, well, rather they're confronting the Russian military and the Russian government, for that matter. We are seeing a excellent form of freedom of speech being displayed through social media, where social media is giving active updates on this particular issue. Now we're recording this on June 24th, so we don't know what will be happening in a week or so. But this is a particular case about how freedom of speech is actually being used, and how it's being formed in places where we generally wouldn't think about. So, for this regard, we've often seen freedom of speech being questioned when it comes to particular issues on what someone can or cannot say. So, as we'll be talking about in further segments, there is a line which you must draw at some point for freedom of speech. But once again, it does depend on the government. So, my opinion on why freedom of speech is important is that to some degree, you should have the right, and it should be established within some form of constitution. It should be very much venerated in that matter, that you will be able to say what you want without having the fear of persecution. But as we will also be discussing, there is a line which you must draw for freedom of speech. Now, let me bring a particular example. Now, in the United States, like many other countries across the globe, there is a rise in far right extremism, namely neo Nazism, for example. Now, we all know about the struggle against Nazism, which happened during World War II, during the interwar years, where one of the most oppressive regimes that the world had ever seen, the Nazi government headed by Adolf Hitler, killed millions and millions of Jews. We can bring up other examples as well. Stalin's regime in Soviet Russia, and he headed a dictatorship unlike any other. And what this showed was that freedom of speech in both of these countries was vastly under threat. I think I can even talk about Soviet Russia in that regard. People were even scared that even a single word uttered against the government, and probably the next day they'd be confronted by the NKVD, the secret police, and they'd probably have their heads chopped off the next day. Yeah, it's rather funny, but we very much hope that we don't live in governments like that right now. But let's keep in mind the the regime of Stalin only happened about 70 years ago. 70 years isn't that long ago, and some people still remember how oppressive Stalin's government was. So now, when we talk about freedom of speech, we understand that there is a line to be drawn. Of course, we don't want neo-Nazism to be on the rise. We don't want hateful speech to be continuously disseminated. But as the argument goes in the US, people should be able to say whatever they want without having persecution. So, in that regard, it's a very, very thought provoking argument about what you can, what you cannot say, and what line you can actually draw for freedom of speech. And the thing is that this argument will continue to be discussed because, for example, social media has a new role in how freedom of speech is important and how it must be defended. I'm sure we all know about Elon Musk's Twitter, and after his takeover of the company from the so called Twitter 1.0, he came in promising a more free Twitter with less censorship and more ability to say whatever you want without persecution. And of course, people have largely been questioning him about what he means by that. Does that mean that you're going to allow more hateful speech, more slurs being used? But largely, Elon has stayed true to his promise. And what he's done is that he's created an environment where people are able to they're able to do things which they probably wouldn't have been able to do in the past. So, for example, now they're able to have shows and discussions with prime ministers, which almost like an interview, which and I find that particularly very very fascinating. And all of this is possible through freedom of speech. It's something which I believe should be venerated, but it definitely should be discussed because it's extremely important that we draw the line and we make sure that hateful comments are not a place of ubiquitousness. So I've spoken for quite a bit. Trish is probably eager to be speaking right now. So, Trish, how about you join in this conversation?
Right. So when you say why freedom of speech is important, so you need freedom of speech because human nature, I feel inertly, is that people need to put across their perspective, people need to put across their ideas. Only when people may feel really frustrated when they say that, oh, you cannot express your idea, especially when you're living in, let's say, a military state, as you maybe put across rightfully in the in Nazi Germany or even Soviet Union, Southern Soviet Union, they constrained your freedom of speech and your freedom of expression, and in a way that does create a lot of a lot of it's torture for a lot of people when they say that their ideas are not, you can't put across your ideas and they're not even valued or they're not even considered. And hence it is really important because certain people will feel that only if those ideas come to light can they actually bring forward change in the society. As I mentioned earlier, I feel that societal reform can occur only when you have freedom of speech, and if you restrict it, in a way, you're restricting reform. And why is it so important as well? Because if you talk about in a political scenario, if you're talking about, let's say, I'm voting for someone, I need to know the full reason why. What are the good things, what are the pros about him, what are the cons about him, what are all, I need to know his full profile, or his or her full profile, their profile, etc. So only when I am fully aware can I actually uh, cast my vote. For example, if freedom of speech is banned, I will not know, let's say, criminal cases levied against a person. I will not know the good things done by a person. I will not know the bad things done by a person in a way. So it is important because after all, I'm putting a vote for a person, and I need to know his or her because they're going when they come to power. I should be well wary about are they going to do the same issues because yeah, that's one particular aspect. Also, another aspect I look at is uh, the freedom of media, like the press freedom news channels have. So only when they can actually put across ideas, put across news, is in a way going to let's say enlighten all of us or allow us to come across or formulate our own opinions. Only when news is presented can we actually um, it's not going to be a really one-sided propaganda. It's not going to be a really one-sided perspective on ideas. So, in a way, that is really important because I think even the propaganda minister Goebbels in Nazi Germany did use a lot of different methods, such as I think even the movies, even the film industry, radio, all of that to voice what his propaganda was. And I think even the BBC played a really important role because in France, in occupied France at that time, they really created hope for people living when they by using their by creating hope that help may be coming to people in occupied France. And it was restricted. I think the if I'm not wrong, the punishment for listening to BBC was death at that time, and that is really important because freedom of speech and freedom of expressing ideas creates hope for a lot of people and can ensure that society um society can it's a place where you can sustain with different perspectives and different people can coexist together. If freedom of speech is banned as if freedom of speech in certain areas is banned, as Kashyap was hinting at, it does. You do require certain places to draw a line, but it's also really important that um, the where the line is drawn, it has to be specified for what reasons and whatever consequences that may be prevented by drawing the line. So, Aditya, you spoke about a line being drawn. So, some people may disagree with you, saying that no line should be drawn, and they may believe that people can say whatever they want, and it should not be there should be no restriction, it should be absolute. So, in your view, where should the line be drawn, and why do you think it should be drawn?
Yeah, so what I would like to clarify is that um, I'm first and foremost I'm a citizen of the U.S. So generally our free speech is considered the most free in the world. But oftentimes, even now, freedom of speech and what kind of line can be drawn is often brought up. So I believe that there are probably two things which I believe with a great amount of uh, with a great amount of passion, there could be a line being drawn. It could, but in varying instances, it should be examined, of course. So the first thing is anti-scientism. All right. Now, this is one which I feel quite strongly about because I feel like science plays a huge role in how we lead our modern society right now. When it comes to anti-scientism, there are various examples that I can talk about. But the main thing which I want to say and where it could be drawn is um, where people deliberately lie on, be it social media or on a public platform, they deliberately lie to stoke fear among the population. So let's talk about anti-Semitism in somewhere as recently as 2020. During the COVID pandemic, there were various claims, often not even based by even a shred of evidence. People started, making all these things which were blatantly anti-scientific, and they were disseminated with close to no restriction. Now, of course, people are well within their rights to make these statements, but when it comes to something as sensitive as the COVID pandemic, where people were as confused as the next person, I do believe that that probably wouldn't have been the best course of action to allow it to be disseminated without any line being drawn. When I bring up a particular instance, we talk about something like flat earthers. In our modern day age, of course, flat earthers do truly exist. They're a small minority, but at the moment, uh, they are spreading, quite frankly, anti-scientism because we do know that the earth is a sphere, and we do know that the earth revolves around the sun. But at the moment, people still do spread this lie, and yeah, thankfully, people don't really believe it. And thankfully, we don't live in an age where, like in the where Galileo Galilei was literally he was called for treason by the Catholic Church, and there was no scientific basis in what the Catholic Church had said at the time, that the Earth was flat. It was just a commonly accepted view for the time. So that's one thing which I want to say about freedom of speech and its line being drawn. The next one, of course, is hate speech. And I feel like this is the one where more people call for it. And I think this is where there's more ambiguity in it, because hate speech can come in varying forms. But I feel like there's only a few instances where I truly believe hate speech exists and a line should be drawn. I think the first one is deliberately stoking fear and spreading extremely radical ideologies and calling for action against certain groups. So I previously mentioned the neo-Nazism, all right, and I am of the opinion that neo-Nazism, people should be able to disseminate their opinions. But what's blatantly wrong is that if these people decide to take the law into their own hands and take violence into their own hands, and we don't even need to speak about what will happen next. So truly dangerous things can happen if no line is being drawn, all right. And I do believe that many ideologies, they're extremely radical. Oftentimes when there's no line being drawn, it's very, very shifty, like what could happen, what couldn't happen, we don't know. So this is where I feel, there could be a line being drawn. Neo-Nazism is just one example, and I could bring about 30 examples, but the point being, you don't want to have people who are ruthlessly insulting you and denigrating you without any real justification. People will feel that they can say whatever they want and they don't need to be held accountable. So that's all I have to really say about a line being drawn. I do think a line should be drawn, but of course, it could be very well debated. And yeah, how about you, Trish?
One really interesting point which you brought up was the concept of Galileo. So when Galileo he was accused of heresy by the church, and he was put under house arrest because he believed that the Earth revolved around the sun. And though it may be proven now that it is in fact correct that the Earth revolves around the sun, at that time the societal norm was that, I mean, it was made to believe that the Earth was the center of everything and the sun revolved around it. So, in a way, Galileo questioned an existing societal norm. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't stress too much on this point again, but uh, if it had been proven wrong or if the church had been proven wrong at that time, if it had been proven that the earth in fact did revolve around the sun, people may start wondering, what about the other values propagated by the church? Are those wrong as well? How is the church aware that those values are correct? And in a way, it did help maintain the power of the church when they put Galileo under house arrest, because it did maintain the harmony of society in a way. And that's really interesting, because I can cite certain other cases as well, because perhaps maybe take a look at North Korea. In North Korea, if perhaps the people of North Korea are made to if they are exposed to views about their supreme leader outside their country, let's say from countries such as America, everywhere else in general, they may see that maybe their leader is not so supreme after all, and that may that may distort their perspective on their country, and that may distort their perspective on the leader. So I do feel that ideology is really the ideology of suppressing freedom of speech as well is propagated to ensure that it's a tool by people in power to ensure that they stay in power in that way. Another example I'd like to cite is the concept of witches, the concept of how people were burnt, people were hung, etc. Women were hung at that time because they did question their societal norm at that time. Women were supposed to be people who could not, let's say, read, people who could not do maths, people who could not basically what do certain stuff. And when they were able to do that, when they were able to express themselves, when they were able to speak about or speak up for their rights, that in a way was suppressed by people to protect their power, so that I mean, in a way, the house the house labor of women, the unpaid labor of women, was required to maintain this so-called harmony of society at that time. So there was one quote by, I think, John Stuart Mill, where he says, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community is to prevent harm to others." So in a way, he's saying that your right to freedom of speech ends where the other person's right begins. The other person knows begins, actually. If that's clear. The thing is, incitement to violence is a possible claim where the other person's nose begins, because when someone says that a certain group of people must be lined up against a wall and shot, which is something which has been stated, um, that does infringe upon the right of another person or another community to live peacefully. And I feel that is where a line must be drawn, a strong line must be drawn, in fact. And it may not just be as simple, I mean, not be as complex as, let's say, killing and all such huge political issues. It can even be on something really simple, like, let's say, pineapple on pizza. For example, I'm of the view that pineapple, I don't prefer pineapple on my pizza. I think I like my pizza without pineapple. Kashyap may be of the view that pineapple belongs in pizza.
No, I actually don't in real life, but go on. Yeah.
Okay. So Kashyap doesn't think pineapple belongs in pizza, but let's say Mr. X. Mr. X says that pineapple, he likes pineapple in pizza. Now the thing is, I'm entitled to the view that pineapple belongs in pizza. I mean, pineapple doesn't belong in pizza, and Mr. X is entitled to the view that pineapple does not belong in pizza. But the important part is that we are entitled to the view until I say that I'm willing to kill you to say, because you believe that pineapple does not belong in pizza. Pineapple belongs in pizza. Sorry, and see, vice versa for Mr. X. So the part where it comes, words can be really powerful. And when I get to, the point I'm getting is, when words are really powerful, they can inflame emotions. And when emotions are inflamed, people start to take action into their hands. And that's the point why I feel incitement to an offense is rightfully a ground where freedom of speech can be restricted in India. And another part where I'd like to get at is, um, let's say, defamation. Defamation should be, um, if it's defamatory towards another person, it's harming the reputation of another person. I feel that it is something which should be looked upon. But I don't think that if it's defamatory to anybody who's working in public, or anybody who has put themselves on a public spectrum, I feel that, let's say, criticism or any form of any statement against a person, it should not be infringed upon. If they have the entire right, because they are willingly and knowing what they're doing, they're putting themselves onto a space where they're their opening all kinds of views towards them. For example, even us, we are putting ourselves on a public space by creating a podcast. So we are, of course, we may get different kind of reactions, we may get statements, but that is something which is expected of by us putting ourselves over here. Another thing we like to talk about is perhaps maybe Holocaust denial. That's somewhere a line should be drawn, because when you talk about in certain countries like Germany and Russia, I think denying the Holocaust is something which is banned, and that is really important, because um, it does talk about how an ideology should not be reverted to, and certain really cruel pieces of history do not are not reborn in a way. And that I feel is really crucial to, let's say, ensure it's maintained.
All right, so now we're going into the next and final segment of our podcast, and that is how freedom of speech is seen across the globe. Now, I feel it's important that we stress that freedom of speech is not defined the same in every single country, and we often have the misconception that one country's definition of freedom of speech is the definition for every other person from every other country. And the commonly cited example from what I've seen on social media is the US's definition of freedom of speech. Now, the US is renowned for having a rather robust definition of freedom of speech. As we've already seen, it's not surprising that this definition is equally ambiguous. The First Amendment provides that Congress makes no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. It protects freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, what we understand from this is number one, it's a wide spectrum of things which are covered. So there's a freedom of speech for religion, press, assembly, etc. But what it does mean is that there are very few gray areas as to, or rather, there are very few places where freedom of speech is actually censored, and that's what makes the U.S. So notable as an example of how truly robust freedom of speech can be and to what extent it can actually go. So, for example, like the example that I had mentioned previously about the neo-Nazi, assembly, those could happen, in various cities across the United States, and technically it would not be censored because by law they have a legal right to assemble. They have their own beliefs, and they are able to, no matter how hateful it is, assemble in a common place, and they would be able to propagate their ideology. And similarly, the opposite thing could happen. For example, when there were protests for the Black Lives Matter protests in July, nationwide protests happened over the killing of George Floyd and what they saw as a systemic form of discrimination against Black people in the United States. So what this told us is that the United States has a rather robust form of freedom of speech. I've used the word robust three times comically. But what it does tell us is that the US has, it's very unique in this aspect, but it's certainly not the only one. And that's something which I hope Trish will be able to talk about other countries. How do other countries do their freedom of speech, Trish?
So I'd like to talk about, let's say, freedom of speech in India for that matter, because as Kashyap is a US citizen, I'd like to think, and I am as an Indian citizen, I'd like to talk a bit more in India. So in India, I think the eight grounds where freedom of speech is restricted are, I think, security of state, interest and sovereignty and integrity of India, friendly relations with foreign state, public order, decency or morality, contempt of court, defamation, and incitement to an offense. So I did cover incitement to an offense a little bit in my last monologue. So I like to think that whenever certain laws are made with, let's say, reasonable restrictions or words which are, it leaves a lot of space to interpretation. And in a way that can be misused highly to being, because especially in India where there is a lot of communalism going on, and especially where there's a lot of different perspective. We are a huge, extremely diverse society. We have different ideas. I think that freedom of speech can be the the grounds of restriction can be misused in a way to, let's say, suppress certain communities. And I do feel that there has to be certain ways in which you can look forward and you can look to re-examine how you can make the laws a bit more specific. But I know it's going to be really difficult. But if it were a bit more specific, it could be a little bit more word by word, and different examples can be given. I think you can reduce the scope of misinterpretation or the misuse of the law. And I feel that maybe looking forward, that may be something which we should really consider. So that brings us to the end of our episode 2 of Vox Rationis on freedom of speech with Trish Karthik. And
Aditya Kashyap.
so it is a really diverse topic. You have different perspectives. There's so much to cover, but we could, unfortunately, how much ever time we had, we tried to bring in as much as we could. So hope you guys enjoyed. It was really fun to make this topic. We actually, it was really self-introspective as well. So Kashyap here would like to bring in a few words as well.
Yeah, so I had a lot of fun talking about this, and once again, I feel like it's a shame. Maybe if we were more qualified, we'd have so much more nuance that we could add to the discussion. But I certainly felt that our students' perspective were actually answered. We covered quite a lot of points, and I think at the end, I'm very happy with how this came out. So, thank you, Trish, and thank you guys for giving us the platform to hold this discussion. Please do tell us in the comments down below if there are certain things which you don't agree with, and I would be quite surprised if nobody came up to us and said this particular thing is wrong, that particular thing is wrong. We are extremely excited to see your comments, and I feel like this is probably a more thought provoking topic that we've chosen than the last one. And for that, I feel like it's going to be all the more exciting to see what comes. So, hope you guys enjoyed it. Subscribe to Vox Rationis, share our videos. We are on Instagram right now, so we'll be uploading far more. And stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.